Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The issues we're analyzing today are the histories of immigration to the United States and American citizenship. And we'll also throw in some discussions on the insane eugenics movement. I want to make some things clear at the outset. This episode is not about what the U.S. should or should not be doing regarding immigration at the present time. I freely admit that I do not have any answers as to how America could have secure borders, yet be fair and humane. This episode is simply examining the history of laws and policies regarding immigration and citizenship from the founding of the U.S. through the late 20th century. For people outside of the U.S., you might not be familiar with the term Native Americans. It does not mean people who were born in the United States. I was born here, but I am not a Native American. The term Native American refers to the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, the people that Christopher Columbus erroneously called Indians. In this episode, I'm just going to be covering voluntary immigration. Obviously, a large segment of American society is descended from those poor people who were brought here involuntarily as part of the horrendous transatlantic slave trade. In one episode, I cannot possibly cover every single immigration or citizenship law in the history of the U.S. I will concentrate on the major laws that greatly affected these issues. And in this limited time, I cannot address the issues of so many immigrant groups that came from all around the world. I will focus on people from a few countries that I think are illustrative of the history of immigration and citizenship in America. Fun fact: there is no official language in the United States. People presume that English is the official language, but it's not. The U.S. has never adopted an official language by law. Some states designate English as their official language, but not the federal government. Under American law, people born outside of the U.S. who become American citizens have all of the rights that natural-born American citizens have except one. Naturalized citizens cannot become president. However, there was an exception which applied back in the 1700s. That exception applied to Alexander Hamilton. He was born on the island of Nevis in the British West Indies in 1755 or 1757. There's an ongoing dispute regarding the year of his birth. There is a famous fallacy that Hamilton could not become president because he was not a native-born American. Not true. Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution states in pertinent part, no person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of President. Hamilton moved to New York in 1772 and was a U.S. citizen at the time the Constitution was ratified in 1788. The first law regarding citizenship was the 1790 Naturalization Act. That law had four main requirements. Number one, any alien who wished to become a citizen had to be a free white person, and that's a direct quote from the law. Number two, the person had to have resided in the U.S. for at least 2 years. Number three, and here is another quote, making proof to the satisfaction of such court that he is a person of good character. Number four, the person applying had to take an oath to support the U.S. Constitution. Presumably, these laws applied to women as well as men. I say presumably because all laws from those days just referred to everybody as he. The 1790 Naturalization Act was repealed and replaced 5 years later by the Naturalization Act of 1795. The main differences contained in the new law were that a person had to be a resident of the U.S. for at least 5 years, and that person had to apply to become a citizen at least 3 years before the application could be ruled upon. The first big wave of immigration came from Ireland due to the potato famine. The population of the island of Ireland just before the potato famine hit in 1845 was 8.2 million. During the famine from 1845 to 1850, approximately 1 million people died. That was about an eighth of the population of the whole island. In addition to losing about 1 million people to starvation, Ireland also lost approximately 1.5 million to emigration, mostly to the United States, between 1845 and 1855. And that was just one decade. It is estimated that from 1820 to today, over 6 million people emigrated from Ireland to the United States. Most people in the United States in the 1840s were Protestant, and a lot of them really resented this giant influx of Irish Catholics. During that same time period, there were large numbers of other immigrant groups, and one in particular. Between 1845 and 1855, more than 1 million Germans emigrated to the U.S. A total of approximately 2.5 million Irish and German immigrants in 10 years caused a nativist movement. Starting in the 1840s, there was a secret society originally known as the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. They became popularly known as the Know-Nothings. They got that name because if you asked somebody if they were part of that secret society, they would reply, "I know nothing." This group became an actual national political party. Although just about everybody referred to them as the Know-Nothings, the official name of the party started out as the Native American Party. How hilarious is that? Obviously, they were not aligning themselves with the indigenous peoples that were living here when the Europeans started colonizing the Americas. A group like this would not embrace the indigenous peoples. After 1855, they changed the name to simply the American Party. In the 1850s, the Know-Nothings accounted for 100 elected members of Congress, 8 governors, and a controlling share of several state legislatures. The Know-Nothings were very anti-immigrant. They supported a lot of crazy things, but here are the 3 worst. Number 1, a 21-year naturalization period for immigrants. Number 2, banning all Catholics from public office. Obviously, they never read the First Amendment to the Constitution. Number 3, prohibiting foreign-born citizens from voting or holding public office. The Know-Nothings ran candidates for president and vice president twice. In 1852, the Know-Nothings really did not connect with voters. But in 1856, the Know-Nothings nominated former President Millard Fillmore. Have you ever even heard of him? Probably not. He is arguably the least known American president. And no, he did not win the presidency as a know-nothing, but he had been the vice president under Zachary Taylor. When Taylor died in office on July 9, 1850, Fillmore became president. By the way, Millard Fillmore was a terrible president. He supported the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Law, possibly the worst law ever passed by the federal government. And he was also aggressive in enforcing the Fugitive Slave Law. In the election of 1856, Fillmore and the Know-Nothings won the state of Maryland and received 8 electoral votes. A party based on hatred and bigotry received electoral votes in an American presidential election. That was the high watermark for the Know-Nothings. In the late 1850s, there became one issue that absolutely dominated American politics: the disgrace of slavery in the United States. Bigotry against Catholics, along with Irish and German immigrants, fell by the wayside as everybody concentrated on slavery and Civil War. On the flip side, during the Civil War, the U.S. government tried to encourage foreign immigration. On May 20, 1862, President Lincoln signed the Homestead Act. The main provision of that law was that anybody 21 years old who was a citizen of the United States or who shall have filed his declaration of intention to become such as required by the naturalization laws of the United States and who had never borne arms against the United States could claim 160 acres of surveyed government land. This land giveaway applied to citizens as well as people applying to become citizens. The main requirement was that the claimants were required to live on and improve their plot of land by cultivating it for 5 years. The Homestead Act resulted in 4 million settlers filing 2.5 million claims to 270 million acres, or approximately 1.09 million square kilometers. That is somewhere around 10% of all U.S. land. Obviously, there were plenty of people already living on these lands, the Native Americans. But in those days, the federal and state governments never considered lands occupied if there were only Native Americans living there. One of the primary purposes of the Homestead Act was to lure people from Europe to become farmers in the middle of the United States. Government leaders thought that this would promote immigration to populate the Midwest and West with people who either were or would eventually become American citizens. During the Civil War, there were three huge progressive programs unrelated to the war or slavery that the U.S. Congress was able to pass because the southern states were essentially not represented in Congress. Up until that time, Southern senators and representatives catered to the very wealthy planter class. These were the people who owned those large plantations with enslaved people. Those Southern senators and representatives were not looking out for the common people of the South and therefore had blocked these three milestone programs. I've already told you that one was the Homestead Act. A second major law was the Transcontinental Railroad. This law was passed on July 1, 1862, and by 1869, resulted in a railroad all the way out here to California. The third major progressive program passed during the Civil War was the Morill Land Grant College Act of 1862. President Lincoln signed the bill into law on July 2, 1862. That law granted each state 30,000 acres of federal land and funded the construction of agricultural and mechanical colleges. The American Civil War resulted in three amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment rid the country of the scourge of slavery once and for all. The 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote. And yes, it was only limited to men. Women did not get the right to vote in federal elections until 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was ratified on July 9, 1868. It contained a lot of provisions, but the one that relates to today's subject matter is the very first sentence, which reads, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside." This was to protect black Americans who were born here but were denied citizenship. It is the 14th Amendment that provides citizenship to anybody born in the United States. Over the years, some people have proposed doing away with birthright citizenship. But a simple law of Congress signed by the President would be meaningless. According to Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The only way to change birthright citizenship would be with an amendment to the Constitution. On October 28, 1886, the Statue of Liberty was officially unveiled in New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty was a gift to the people of the United States from the people of France. That is utterly remarkable. Can you imagine that occurring today? Really, can you imagine the people from any country today giving another country a gift of this magnitude? But the people from the U.S. were responsible for building the pedestal. The New Colossus is a sonnet by American poet Emma Lazarus. She wrote the poem for an auction to raise money for the construction of the pedestal in 1883. In 1903, her sonnet was cast into a bronze plaque and mounted inside the pedestal's lower level, where it remains today. Since the late 1800s, the following lines from the New Colossus have become synonymous with the spirit of the Statue of Liberty. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me." Man, I wish I could write like that. That attitude, expressed by Emma Lazarus of embracing immigrants, was widely held by Americans in the late 1800s. But not by all. In the middle of the 1800s, a lot of immigrants came to the west coast of the U.S. from China. These people were very poor and therefore worked for very low wages. They were willing to take a lot of the dirty and dangerous jobs that native-born Americans would not. In the 1850s, these Chinese were doing a lot of the work in the mines during the California Gold Rush. A lot of the men who built the first transcontinental railroad were Chinese. But at some point, some Americans decided that they did not want any more people from China. So the United States government passed the only immigration law which ever targeted people from one particular country. This was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed on May 6, 1882. Here are the key points of that statute. Number one, the law was being passed because, and this is a quote, "the coming of Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good order of certain localities within the territory thereof." Number two, the immigration of any Chinese laborers was suspended, meaning they could no longer come to the U.S. Number three, any Chinese laborers that were already in the U.S. had to leave within 90 days, but this did not apply to anybody who was already in the U.S. as of November 17, 1880. Number four, any vessel which brought Chinese laborers into the United States could be fined up to $500 for each and every Chinese laborer and could be imprisoned for up to a year. $500 was a lot in 1882. It would be the equivalent to over $15,000 today. The Chinese Exclusion Act got extended indefinitely. It was only repealed in 1943 because, in World War II, the U.S. and China were allies against the Axis powers, and it really looked bad to totally exclude immigrants from one of America's allies. The Immigration Act of 1891 placed immigration under federal jurisdiction. The federal government assumed direct control of inspecting, admitting, rejecting, and processing all immigrants seeking admission to the United States. Before this, states often had responsibilities to carry out federal immigration laws. I have lived most of my life in California, but I grew up in Connecticut, approximately 20 miles outside of New York City. When I was a kid, I went to the Statue of Liberty many times. I remember taking the boat ride from Battery Park at the southern tip of Manhattan out to Liberty Island. Before the boat would dock at Liberty Island, we would pass by this deserted island with abandoned buildings. It was Ellis Island. And in case you've never heard of it, for 62 years, it was the primary entry point into the United States for immigrants. Because of the huge numbers of immigrants from Europe, the federal government decided to create an installation in New York Harbor to process all of these people who wanted to become Americans. Ellis Island opened as an immigration center on January 1, 1892. That year, 400,000 immigrants were processed at Ellis Island. In 1913, there were some days when as many as 5,600 immigrants were coming through Ellis Island. The peak year was 1907, when 1.2 million immigrants were processed there. 70% of all immigrants at that time came through Ellis Island. The remaining 30% came through 81 various other immigration centers throughout the U.S. From 1910 to 1940, the primary immigration center on the West Coast was Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco Bay. It was kind of like the Ellis Island for the Pacific Ocean. During those 30 years that it was in operation, approximately 1 million immigrants were processed at Angel Island. According to the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation website, Ellis Island rejected approximately 6% of the immigrants who arrived in New York, but Angel Island rejected up to 33% of the immigrants arriving in San Francisco Bay. Why the giant disparity? Well, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 eliminated a large percentage of people who wanted to come to America, and other laws restricted people from other Asian nations. Here's a disconcerting fact that most people don't know about Ellis Island. Not all immigrants that arrived in New York Harbor had to be processed at Ellis Island. First class and second class passengers did not go to Ellis Island at all. They disembarked at the docks in Manhattan. Only steerage passengers had to be processed through Ellis Island and faced the possibility of being rejected and sent home. And in case you were unfamiliar with that term, steerage was the part of the ship for passengers with the cheapest tickets. Think about how heartbreaking it had to be for those people who had to return to their home country where life was so miserable that they risked everything to come to America. Most of the people who were rejected entry at Ellis Island were those that the authorities deemed to have a criminal history or a contagious disease. The biggest disease the doctors were checking for was trachoma. According to the World Health Organization website, trachoma is a disease of the eye caused by infection with the bacterium Chlamydia trachomatis. It can cause irreversible blindness. Infection spreads through personal contact via hands, clothes, bedding, or hard surfaces. Ellis Island closed on November 29, 1954. During its 62 years as an immigration center, over 12 million immigrants were processed there. It is estimated that half of all Americans have at least one ancestor who went through Ellis Island. Both of my grandparents on my mother's side did. In 1990, Ellis Island was reopened as a museum. To raise money for the renovations, Americans could donate money in the name of their relatives who had passed through Ellis Island. The names of those people were placed onto metal plaques displayed on Ellis Island. I have always been very happy that my brother Bill thought to do so for my maternal grandparents. When I took my two children to Ellis Island, I showed them the plaques listing my grandfather's name and my grandmother's name. Unless you are a Native American, we are all descendants of immigrants. Obviously, some Americans are descendants of people who were brought to this country against their will during the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. But most Americans are descendants of voluntary immigrants. And for most of us, we don't have to go back many generations. My father's family is purportedly completely of Irish descent, but I don't have any information as to when my father's ancestors came to America from Ireland. Was it during the potato famine? Was it sometime later? I just don't know. My mother's family is a lot easier to track down. My grandparents on my mother's side both came from Italy. My grandfather was named Rocco. In 1905, he came to the United States when he was 16 years old with his older brother Francesco. Rocco and Francesco, are those classic Italian names or what? They came through Ellis Island and ended up in Greenwich, Connecticut because they had an uncle living there. They never saw their parents or their homeland again. By 1983, both of my grandparents were gone. 5 years later, in 1988, my wife Cindy and I went to Italy on our honeymoon. We took a trip down to Rose Cosenza in the province of Calabria. We got to meet my grandfather's sister, who was still alive. She did not have a telephone, so I had written a letter to her that we were going to visit. Unfortunately, she never received the letter. When we visited my great-aunt Filomena, she had no idea we were coming. I speak some Italian, but it is very limited. Fortunately, my second cousin Anna, who is fluent, was visiting at the same time and she could translate for me. When Aunt Filomena understood who I was, she went nuts. She broke down into tears. When my grandfather left in 1905, she never saw him again. She never met any of his children, and I was the first of his grandchildren that she ever met. This was 83 years after her brother Rocco had left home. It amazed me how much her personality was like my grandfather's. She joked and told stories just like he did. I asked her why some of her siblings made the treacherous journey to America. She explained that they were poor and starving. Most of southern Italy was at that time. So first, the boys went to America because they thought it would be safer and that they would have an easier time finding jobs. Then some of the girls went to the U.S. and lived with their male relatives. But Aunt Filomena married a local Italian guy and stayed in Calabria. During our entire visit, my great-aunt refused to let go of me. She held my hand the entire time. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Although I have always been impressed with my grandfather and appreciate his sacrifice in coming to America, I have always been more impressed with my grandmother, Maria. My grandmother was easily the bravest person I have ever known. When she came to the U.S. in 1913, she was only 20 years old and was traveling alone. At least my grandfather had his brother with him, and they were two young men who presumably could defend themselves. My grandmother was 5 feet tall. I'm not sure how they measure height in other countries, whether it's by centimeters or meters, but that means she was only 152 centimeters or 1.5 meters tall. She was a tiny woman who 6 months earlier had been a teenager, and she was traveling by herself. It had to be terrifying for this tiny young woman to leave her homeland and travel by boat, crowded into steerage with hundreds of strangers. Around that time, most ships took approximately 5 to 7 days to cross the Atlantic, and conditions in steerage were terrible. People were crammed into the bottom of the ship with very little ventilation. Usually, there was no separate dining room. The people in steerage ate and slept and spent all of their time in one giant room with men, women, and children all mixed up and sleeping in bunk beds that were very close together. From what I've read, it really stunk with the smell of unwashed bodies and whatever food they were eating. On some boats, they did not get to go up onto the deck to get fresh air, and even if they did, it wasn't for long. Imagine spending 5 to 7 days living like this, and imagine being a 20-year-old woman who's 5 feet tall and traveling by herself, surrounded by strangers, a large percentage of them men. I cannot imagine that my grandmother felt very safe, or that any woman in those circumstances felt safe. It had to be terrifying. After the 5 to 7 days crossing the Atlantic, the ship pulled into New York Harbor. Today, I kick myself that I never asked either of my grandparents what it was like to see the Statue of Liberty for the first time. It had to be the thrill of their lives. But I'm sure the excitement of seeing the Statue of Liberty quickly passed because the next stop was Ellis Island. I don't know any details about what it was like for my grandmother on Ellis Island. It is my understanding that she was not detained and was one of the people that was quickly put onto a ferry boat over to Manhattan. Somehow, my grandmother got to Grand Central Station, although she did not remember how she got there. She was going to Greenwich, Connecticut because she had a brother living there, a man who worked for the railroad, spoke Italian, and wrote a note in English and pinned it onto her sweater so the conductor would tell her where to get off. I cannot even envision how awful it had to be for a tiny young woman to get on a boat knowing she would never see her parents again, let alone siblings or cousins or friends. It had to be heartbreaking. And it's not like today when you can video chat, make phone calls, email, text. Although telephones were fairly common in 1913, these immigrants knew that they could not afford to be calling home. Of course, my grandmother's parents did not have a phone in Italy anyway. Think about what it was like leaving home, knowing that the best you would be able to do would be able to write letters and maybe send or receive a photograph once in a great while. I think of my grandparents as the typical immigrants to the United States. My grandfather learned how to speak English and eventually became a citizen on April 30, 1940. The men would learn to speak English because they worked outside of the home. My grandmother never became a citizen and never really learned to speak English. She could speak some very limited broken English, but not much. These were days when the women stayed at home with their enormous families. There was no birth control in those days. I grew up in the same neighborhood where my grandparents lived. It was typical of immigrant neighborhoods. When my grandparents first moved in, everybody was speaking Italian, but the next generation, my mom's generation, spoke English as their primary language. When I was a kid, I thought it was crazy that my mother and my grandmother would hold conversations with my grandmother speaking only Italian and my mother only speaking English, yet they understood each other. Although my mother could understand Italian, she never learned to speak it. The only reason I can speak some rudimentary Italian is because I took classes in it. When I visit Greenwich now and I go to my old neighborhood, nobody's speaking Italian. It's the classic story of all immigrant communities. The area became Americanized. My grandparents came to the U.S. so that their kids would have better lives than they did, and their grandchildren even better lives. As a result of the sacrifice of my grandparents in coming to America and the advancement of my mother's generation, I had the opportunity to go to college and law school and to practice law for 31 years. And in case you're wondering, my father did not graduate high school because he dropped out to go to work when he was 16 because of the Great Depression. He made a career as a house painter. I am incredibly grateful for the sacrifices of my grandparents and my parents that I could live the life that I've lived. I outline my family's history because I think it is illustrative of a very large percentage of immigrants to the United States and their descendants. My grandparents came to the U.S. when the immigration floodgates were open. During 1 year at the turn of the 20th century, 220,000 Italians came to the U.S. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians came to the United States. Things were so bad in Italy that approximately 14% of the Italian population migrated to America. To put that into perspective, the current population of the United States is approximately 336 million. 14% of that figure would be approximately 47 million people. Can you imagine 47 million people leaving the United States in a 40-year period? And it wasn't just Italians coming. In the 30 years from 1890 to 1920, 18 million immigrants poured into the United States. Although millions of immigrants were pouring into the United States, there was still the question about who could become a citizen. This brings us to the infamous U.S. Supreme Court case of Ozawa versus United States. If you'd like to look it up and read the opinion for yourself, the citation is 260 U.S. 178. That was a 1922 case which dealt with who could become American citizens under the existing laws. The Supreme Court opinion summarized the case as follows. Mr. Ozawa was born in Japan but had lived in the United States for 20 years. He went to high school in Berkeley, California, and attended the University of California for 3 years. He educated his children in American schools and utilized the English language in his home. As the court noted, Mr. Ozawa was clearly a good person who deeply embraced everything about being an American. On October 16, 1914, Mr. Ozawa applied for citizenship in Hawaii, which was then a U.S. territory. Hawaii did not become a state until 1959. The Supreme Court opinion explained why the citizenship application was denied. The District Court of Hawaii, however, held that, having been born in Japan and being of the Japanese race, he was not eligible to naturalization under Section 2169 of the revised statutes and denied the petition. It came down to a question as to whether or not he was white. As the Supreme Court stated, in all of the naturalization acts from 1790 to 1906, the privilege of naturalization was confined to white persons. The Supreme Court explained the determination that the words white person are synonymous with the words a person of the Caucasian race. The Supreme Court further explained the appellant in the case now under consideration, however, is clearly of a race which is not Caucasian. So what did all of these quotes I just gave you from the Supreme Court decision mean? Simply stated, federal law at the time said that only white people could become citizens, and since Mr. Ozawa was born in Japan, he was definitely not what the Supreme Court defined as white and not entitled to become an American citizen. This was truly a low point in the history of American law. The giant numbers of Italians, along with Eastern European Jews, were alarming a lot of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in America and led to the horrendous 1924 immigration law, which I will explain in a little bit. Between 1880 and 1924, when the landmark immigration law was passed, it is estimated that as many as 3 million Eastern European Jews came to the U.S. Of course, not all Anglo-Saxon Protestants in America felt the same way, but a lot were very unhappy with this total of approximately 7 million Jews and Italians pouring into the U.S. The Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK, was big in the U.S. at 2 different times. The first incarnation of the Klan was right after the Civil War, when ex-Confederates formed a terrorist group which committed violence and murder against the freed blacks in the southern states. The KKK had a resurgence in the 1920s, and this time it was not limited to the South. The Ku Klux Klan had become so big and so accepted that on August 8, 1925, more than 50,000 KKK members marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. in their KKK outfits. Imagine the Ku Klux Klan brazenly parading in our nation's capital. And although they wore their ludicrous Klan costumes, they had the hoods pulled up so they could show their faces. They weren't worried about being identified. This is one of the low points of American history. And in the 1920s, the Klan expanded their hatreds. Of course, they still hated blacks, but they found that they could also hate immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. And their message of intolerance resonated with certain segments of America who wanted to uphold what they considered traditional white Christian small-town values. Fortunately for the bigots, it now seemed that they might have science on their side. In 1916, a man named Madison Grant published a book entitled The Passing of the Great Race. You can tell by that title that the book was going to be a problem. In his book, Madison Grant claimed that different ethnic groups had certain characteristics, both good and bad. And the best group consisted of people from Northern Europe who Grant called Nordics. This meant people from the British Isles, Scandinavia, Germany, and the Netherlands. The Passing of the Great Race was widely read and became a basis for the racist immigration laws of the 1920s. The book was also praised by a lunatic outcast politician in Germany named Adolf Hitler. Madison Grant claimed that his book was based upon science. It wasn't. On July 22, 1822, Gregor Mendel was born in what is now the Czech Republic. He became a priest but spent most of his time in research and teaching. Mendel is considered the founder of the science of genetics. That's genetics, not to be confused with eugenics. Mendel experimented with pea plants and crossbred them to see which traits would be transmitted in a genetic fashion. His research led people to study genetics in human beings. We now know that certain physical traits do get passed down from parents to children. Here's an easy example. My wife has blue eyes, and so do I. By the discovered laws of genetics, both of our kids were destined to have blue eyes, since that is a recessive gene and had to be inherited from both parents. It's now time to talk about the appalling pseudoscience called eugenics. In 1883, an English statistician named Francis Galton coined the term eugenics. Galton invented the term from Greek words meaning good and birth. Eugenics were based upon completely erroneous understandings of the works of Gregor Mendel, along with Charles Darwin's explanations of evolution. The people espousing eugenics claimed that it was possible to perfect humankind through genetics and the laws of inheritance. Galton believed that the human race could be improved by selective breeding of people with good characteristics and preventing the breeding of people with bad characteristics. I'm sure you can already see where this is going. There were two major problems with eugenics. Number one, even if eugenics theories were true, which they definitely were not, who decides? Really, who decides which characteristics are good and will lead to the betterment of humankind? And how would they make these decisions? It's probably already occurred to you of the horrors if a country truly applied eugenics to the ultimate extreme. It's what the Nazis did in the 1930s and 40s. Problem number two, eugenics tried to quantify things that are vague and ambiguous and definitely not inheritable. The example I gave you about blue eyes is something that can be easily quantified. More important, it's a physical characteristic. Eugenics dealt with moral and mental attributes. The eugenics crusaders thought that they could measure which people had these types of conditions or features: feeble-mindedness, artistic talent, musical talent, laziness, tendency to violence, aggression, intellectual curiosity, mechanical ability, good temperament, bad temperament, courage, cowardice, immorality, promiscuousness, likeliness to be successful, likeliness to be destitute, and virtue. These are not inheritable attributes or qualities. Some of these are personality traits. Most of these individual characteristics are based upon the circumstances in which an individual is raised, their parents, their community, their education, employment opportunities, and the times and location in which they lived. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, there were plenty of examples that defied the theories of eugenics. There were people that had been considered intelligent, well-educated, and industrious, yet they were standing in breadlines for food because they could not find a job. One of the people that gave credibility to the nonsense of eugenics was a psychologist named Henry Goddard. In 1910, he coined the term moron. I know that today it's just used as an insult to people, but Goddard was the person who invented the word. Psychologists were already calling people with the lowest intelligence idiots, and the next highest group, imbeciles. Henry Goddard came up with a label for the next highest intelligence group, which he called morons. Those terms were not supposed to be insults. Amazingly, they were considered clinical terms, and if you got characterized as one of those, you might be sent to an asylum. In 1912, Goddard published a book called The Kallikak Family, a study in the heredity of feeble-mindedness. The book traces the lineage of a patient in the facility where Goddard was working. He referred to her as Deborah Kallikak, but her real name was Emma Wolverton. Goddard made up the last name of Kallikak. The book traces Emma Wolverton's ancestors to a man that Goddard called Martin Kallikak. During the American Revolution, Martin Kallikak married a woman that Goddard deemed was a normal person. Through that marriage, Martin Kallikak had several generations of normal children, grandchildren, etc. But during the American Revolution, Martin Kallikak had a sexual encounter with a barmaid that Henry Goddard identified as feeble-minded. This resulted in 6 generations of feeble-minded people, culminating in Emma Wolverton. According to Henry Goddard, this study proved the eugenics theory. When 2 people who were both considered normal had children, the future generations would be normal. But once you mix in a feeble-minded person, then you were going to produce generations of the feeble-minded. There was absolutely no scientific basis for this. Recent research revealed that Goddard's account of the Kallikak family was at best inaccurate and in some cases completely fictitious. Goddard based his research on untrained workers who interviewed people and recorded information based upon second and third-hand accounts as to who was feeble-minded or in some other way defective. Today, no credible people in psychology or any mental health field believe in the theories outlined in the Kallikak book. Unfortunately, in the early 20th century, a lot of people believed in eugenics and the hereditary nature of these so-called bad traits. This led to selective breeding to stop people considered as defectives from passing on their bad genes. Eventually, 32 states had involuntary sterilization laws for the feeble-minded. Somebody had to stop these defective people from breeding. But this was America. We have rights that are set forth in the Constitution. States can't go around sterilizing people against their will. You would think that would be the case, but you would be wrong. The United States Supreme Court addressed this issue in the 1927 case of Buck versus Bell. The citation is 274 U.S. 20. One of the remarkable things about this case is the fact that the decision was 8-1. Only one justice dissented. Even more surprising is the fact that the opinion was authored by Oliver Wendell Holmes. In case you've never heard of him, he is considered one of the greatest jurists in the history of the United States. This was not his finest work, to say the least. Here are some excerpts from the court's opinion. First, Justice Holmes described the pertinent facts of the case. He explained that Carrie Buck is a feeble-minded white woman who was committed to the state colony. That was an asylum. The court opinion further explained that Carrie Buck is the daughter of a feeble-minded mother in the same institution and the mother of an illegitimate feeble-minded child. The court opinion then identified the state statute in question. An act of Virginia, approved March 20, 1924, recites that the health of the patient and the welfare of society may be promoted in certain cases by sterilization of mental defectives. Yeah, you heard me. For the welfare of society, the state could involuntarily sterilize people deemed as mental defectives. It is explained that the rationale for this position is that experience has shown that heredity plays an important part in the transmission of insanity, imbecility, etc. The Supreme Court detailed. The judgment finds the facts that have been recited and that Carrie Buck is the probable potential parent of socially inadequate offspring, likewise afflicted, that she may be sexually sterilized without detriment to her general health, and that her welfare and that of society will be promoted by her sterilization, and thereupon makes the order. And here is the absolutely horrible rationale for sterilizing somebody against their will because they might be mentally incompetent. Justice Holmes explained, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt to be such by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes." And then Justice Holmes finished with one of the worst sentences ever written by the United States Supreme Court. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. There you have it. The Supreme Court decided that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. The state could involuntarily sterilize somebody to prevent them from having more people considered imbeciles or otherwise defective. And who were these people who were being sterilized against their will? A lot of them were like Carrie Buck, that the state deemed were mentally deficient. But there were plenty who were sterilized because they were deaf or blind or some other kind of physical ailment. A large percentage of the people targeted for this forced sterilization were minorities and poor people, as well as women who were deemed to be too promiscuous. Obviously, no men were deemed to be too promiscuous. The case of Buck versus Bell has never been overturned. For all you non-lawyers out there, that means that this case is still valid law. How horrendous is that? Fortunately, the Virginia Sterilization Act was repealed in 1974, and the practice of involuntary sterilization ended throughout the U.S. in the 1970s. But while those laws were in effect, over 60,000 Americans were sterilized against their will. The reason I just outlined this history of eugenics is because it was used as a justification for keeping certain peoples from immigrating to the United States. The pseudoscience of eugenics showed that certain races or people from certain countries had higher percentages of individuals with these bad traits. If we let people into the U.S. from countries that have much higher percentages of people with these defective characteristics, then they would ruin the gene pool here in America. Can you believe that government leaders and supposedly mental health care experts accepted this? Well, they did. There was now supposedly a scientific rationale to keep out people from Southern and Eastern Europe and, of course, all of Asia. This rationale led to the passage of an Emergency Immigration Act in 1921, which was replaced with a permanent law 3 years later. That's when the federal government passed the infamous Immigration Act of 1924. This law did what it was intended to do. The people in support of the Immigration Act of 1924 said they wanted to curtail the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. These people definitely wanted to reduce the immigration from Greece and Poland and other Southern and Eastern European countries, but the primary targets were the Italians and Eastern European Jews because they were coming to America in such alarming numbers. In the years leading up to World War I, 35% of all immigrants to the U.S. were coming from Italy and Russia. The people coming from Russia were Jews escaping the pogroms. The people behind this new immigration law wanted immigrants from the British Isles, Germany, Scandinavia, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Immigration Act of 1924 had two primary provisions. Number one, the law capped total immigrants per year at 165,000. This greatly cut down on the total number of immigrants. Number two, the new law was also designed to allow entry for immigrants from the right kind of countries and reduce or exclude people from countries that were considered undesirable. So they came up with this brilliant idea of a quota system. The National Origins Quota System started with the 1921 Emergency Act, but it was extended permanently in the 1924 law. The new law would limit the number of people immigrating to the U.S. to 2% of the people from that particular country who were living in the United States in 1890. The feeling was that in the 1890 census, the United States was not overrun by Jews, Italians, and other nationalities considered undesirable. But it's worse than you think. In law, definitions are key. The 1924 Immigration Act used a very broad definition for national origins, not just people who were born in a particular country. Americans were defined by their country of ancestry. Here's an example. If a particular American could trace their ancestry back to the Mayflower in 1620, they were designated as being of English descent. So that particular person would be counted towards the number of people of English ethnicity in the 1890 census, even though their family had lived here for centuries. So when they were doling out quotas, there were a lot of people whose families had been in the U.S. for many generations, but were counted as English, German, Dutch, etc. As a result, the number of people allowed to enter the U.S. from Southern and Eastern European countries plummeted, but people from Northern and Western Europe could enter the U.S. much more easily. In fact, British quotas often went unfulfilled. Of course, the Jews and Italians had it much better than people from Asia. The 1924 Immigration Act included a provision which excluded from entry into the United States aliens ineligible for citizenship. That meant people that were ineligible for citizenship based upon their race. As I told you earlier, the Supreme Court in the case of Ozawa versus United States clearly stated that Asians were not considered white and therefore could not become American citizens under existing federal laws. And in case you're wondering how much of Asia was excluded, the answer, all of it. Mr. Ozawa was from Japan, and the Supreme Court ruled that people from East Asia were definitely not white and could not become citizens. But what about Southern Asia? The Supreme Court decided that in the 1923 case of United States versus Bhagat Singh Ting. If you wish to look it up, the citation is 261 U.S. 204. His last name is spelled Thind, and I'm not sure, but I believe it's pronounced Ting. If I'm mispronouncing it, my apologies. In that case, Mr. Ting was born in India, which at that time was a British colony. He moved to the United States and planned to live here permanently. He even volunteered for the U.S. Army in World War I. He later applied to become a citizen, but the Supreme Court said that since he was from India, he was not considered white and therefore could not become a citizen under existing laws. Simply put, the 1924 Immigration Act completely barred barred people from Asia. And I know what you're wondering. What about blacks? Black people were not excluded from becoming citizens because of the constitutional amendments and laws from the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. The Naturalization Act of 1870 specifically granted the process for citizenship to, and this is a quote, aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent. So people from Africa were not completely excluded like people from Asia. Don't get the wrong idea. Africans were not welcome. Because of the quota system, only 1,100 people from the entire continent of Africa were allowed into the U.S. per year. To put that into perspective, the UK had a quota of 34,007 people per year. That one country, the United Kingdom, was granted almost 31 times the permissible number of immigrants than the entire continent of Africa. The national origins quotas were enforced far from the U.S. Anybody who wanted to emigrate to the U.S. had to apply for visas at the American consulate or embassy closest to where they lived. If they were not granted a visa, they could not come to America. So as the numbers of immigrants plummeted, it wasn't people being turned away at Ellis Island or other such places. They were being turned away at the U.S. consulate or embassy in their home countries. There were no quotas limiting people from countries in the Western Hemisphere. There were never any calls for limitations on Canadians because there's never been any objection to Canadians. Most Americans view Canadians as our more polite cousins. But there's been a history of bigotry against people from Mexico. The first big influx of Mexicans into the United States occurred with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which ended the Mexican-American War. Pursuant to that treaty, the U.S. acquired approximately half of Mexico's territory. All of the Mexicans living in that territory were suddenly living in the United States. So why weren't there any limits on the number of Mexicans entering the country in the 1924 Immigration Act? The answer was economics. The economies in the southwestern states greatly depended upon people from Mexico and the rest of Latin America who would work cheaply and who were willing to do absolutely horrible jobs. This was especially true here in California. The Central Valley of California is one of the most productive agricultural regions in the entire world. California has less than 4% of America's total amount of farmland, yet California produces 13% of the total value of America's agricultural production. Even today, most of the people picking fruits and vegetables on these California farms are either from Latin America or they are of Latino descent. Native-born white Americans are not clamoring for these backbreaking jobs in the heat of Central California. A tragic consequence of the new immigration laws and the quota system occurred in the 1930s when European Jews were trying to escape the Nazis. The most infamous and most heart-wrenching of these incidents involved a ship called the St. Louis. That was a German ocean liner which left Hamburg, Germany on May 13, 1939. That was less than 4 months before World War II erupted in Europe. Almost all of the 937 passengers on the St. Louis were Jewish refugees fleeing the cruelty of the Third Reich. The ship was originally bound for Havana, but when they arrived there, the Cuban government had canceled their landing permits. The St. Louis then sailed for the U.S., but the American government refused to accept the passengers because they did not have U.S. immigration visas. By 1939, Germany had already annexed Austria. The 1939 immigration quota for Germany and Austria was 27,370. That quota had already been filled for the year. Under existing laws, visas could only be granted to the passengers of the St. Louis by denying visas to some of the many thousand German and Austrian Jews who were already on a waiting list. And the American government refused to break its own quota law, even though these were extreme circumstances which were literally life and death. So the St. Louis returned to Western Europe, but not to Germany. Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands each admitted some of the passengers. Obviously, the ones in the UK were safe from the Nazis. But the German war machine overran France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in May and June of 1940. Some of the passengers from the St. Louis had already gotten out of those countries, but 532 St. Louis passengers were caught by the Nazis. Around half of those survived the war, but tragically, 254 passengers from the St. Louis were killed in the Holocaust. 7 years after the end of World War II, the federal government passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. Unfortunately, that law kept the quota system for immigration, although the specific quotas were revised. But there was one good part of that law: the end of the racial basis for citizenship. Part of that law still exists today and is found at 8 United States Code, Section 1422, which reads, "The right of a person to become a naturalized citizen of the United States shall not be denied or abridged because of race or sex or because such person is married." On October 3, 1965, in a ceremony held at the base of the Statue of Liberty, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. The primary object of that law was to end the quota system, which limited people from certain countries entering the United States. This was the elimination of restricting immigrants based upon national origin. America was no longer giving preference to people from Northern and Western Europe. This opened up immigration from Asia, Africa, and Oceania. The new law prioritized highly skilled immigrants and assisted people with family already living in America. The law capped the total number of annual visas at 290,000. However, these restrictions did not apply to spouses, parents, and children of American citizens. Prior to the 1965 law, there had never been any quotas limiting immigration from any countries in the Western Hemisphere. The 1965 Immigration Act imposed an annual cap of 120,000 immigrants from Western Hemisphere countries and an annual cap of 170,000 visas for immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere. President Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 in November of that year. That law granted amnesty to a lot of illegal aliens. As explained on the Library of Congress website, this act introduced civil and criminal penalties to employers who knowingly hired undocumented immigrants or individuals unauthorized to work in the U.S. However, the act also offered legalization, which led to lawful permanent residence and prospective naturalization to undocumented migrants who entered the country prior to 1982. Farm workers who could validate at least 90 days of employment also qualified for lawful permanent residency. On January 19, 1989, in his last full day in office, Ronald Reagan gave his last presidential speech, and it was about immigrants. He liked the symbolism of the Statue of Liberty.
Yes, the torch of Lady Liberty symbolizes our freedom and represents our heritage, the compact with our parents, our grandparents, and our ancestors. It is that lady who gives us our great and special place in the world. For it's the great life force of each generation of new Americans that guarantees that America's triumph shall continue unsurpassed into the next century and beyond.
Later in the speech, Reagan explained why he thought immigrants were so important.
This, I believe, is one of the most important sources of America's greatness. We lead the world because, unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength, from every country and every corner of the world. And by doing so, we continuously renew and enrich our nation. While other countries cling to the stale past, here in America, we breathe life into dreams, we create the future, and the world follows us into tomorrow. Thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we're a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas, and always on the cutting edge, always leading the world to the next frontier. This quality is vital to our future as a nation. If we ever closed the door to new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost.
And towards the end of that speech, Reagan explained the economic and non-economic benefits from immigrants.
It is bold men and women yearning for freedom and opportunity who leave their homelands and come to a new country to start their lives over. They believe in the American dream, and over they make it come true for themselves, for their children, and for others. They give more than they receive, they labor and succeed, and often they are entrepreneurs. But their greatest contribution is more than economic, because they understand in a special way how glorious it is to be an American. They renew our pride and gratitude in the United States of America.
I present these segments from Reagan's last presidential speech not for the sentiments of America being better than everybody else, but because I like his expression of how important immigrants have been to the growth and vitality of the United States. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. If you are listening on any podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to leave a review. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page and leave a rating, hopefully 5 stars, and then tap Write a Review. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for all of the history geeks. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.